Welcome back to Perspectives on Human Communication. This is our second interpersonal theory that we're going to be looking at, and it's called Coordinated Management of Meaning. It's a theory that was begun by one of the scholars was Barnett Pierce, and in class we'll maybe hear a little bit from him about what this theory is about. But what I really love about this theory is it gets at the heart of how communication is really at the center of the quality of our life. And so this is an excerpt from one of the authors and what they say about CMM, that the quality of our personal lives and our social worlds is directly related to the quality of communication with which we engage. I hope you can see how important and how fundamental communication is to the happiness, the joy, the satisfaction that you have in life. And that's really what coordinated management of meaning is trying to figure out. It's trying to get at what are the pieces that are operating in there that explain or determine how whether you're having a high quality or a low quality of communication, and how it's impacting your life. So let's define CMM, and then we will quickly survey the three assumptions behind this theory as well. So CMM is really interested in how we establish the rules for creating and interpreting meaning. If you remember back in chapter 2, we talked about different approaches to theory, and one of them was rules theory. The idea that as people interact, rules emerge, and as those rules emerge and kind of take hold in an interaction, people decide whether they're going to subscribe to those rules or create new rules, and they have to agree on what are the rules for our interaction. So you might think about meeting your roommate for the first time, and maybe it's somebody that you didn't know, and you kind of were figuring each other out and establishing rules for how you were going to live in that shared space together. As you add more roommates to the pot in a bigger dorm situation or apartment situation, the rules maybe become a little bit more complicated because you've got more people and they have to agree or disagree with the rules, and you've got to figure out how the rules apply differentially to different people. All of that is about how rules emerge in interaction. The second part of the theory is how are those rules enmeshed into, and how do they organize conversation? So how do we speak the rules, and how do we negotiate the rules in interaction? And then also, how is meaning constantly being coordinated, and how is it playing with or within those intersecting hierarchies of rules that you've created with the people that you're in interaction with? So let's dive into the assumptions. We've got three assumptions with this theory again. And the first assumption is that humans live in communication. Humans don't just communicate, but we live in a communicative environment. So communication is central. But we have to go back to our natures of comm as well and remember that communication is also dynamic. It's a dynamic process, which means that it's unfolding, and that it's sometimes going really well, sometimes it's not going very well. Sometimes there are scripts that people abide by, sometimes people throw those scripts out, and then you're negotiating new terrain. We also, in this assumption, want to remember that social situations are actually created via interaction. That should sound familiar based upon our symbolic interactionism theory. It had the same concept that social situations were actually created, manifested within an interaction. Assumption number 2 is that we as humans co-create social reality. So this theory is one of the first theories that is really abiding by that social constructionist perspective. And it's the idea that personal beliefs, meanings, the things that we are creating together socially, that we do that, again, we make meaning together in the process of conversation. We decide who somebody is in conversation. We decide what we think about a situation or a group or an event, and we do that in conversation. And so that's social constructionism. We decide even something as simple as is the room too hot or too cold? And as you negotiate that with roommates, eventually you will change the thermostat or not. But the idea of is the room too hot or too cold is a social construction. Everybody has to agree. And if you disagree, now you're arguing and fighting about what temperature it's going to be, and the thermostat's going to be bumped up and down by different people. So the assumption number 2, we're co-creating the social reality together, and in the part of one of the corollaries is in part in doing that, we are reflecting on our past experience and bringing that to the table in the current conversation. So it's not only co-constructing currently, but all of our history and field of experience, remember, that you bring with you in a transactional communication event. You're bringing that all with you, and that's helping to form and create that new reality. And then the third assumption is that information transactions need both a personal layer of meaning and an interpersonal layer of meaning. So the personal layer of meaning is you bringing all of your idiosyncrasies, the things that make you unique, all of your past interactions to the table, and that's how you understand a given interaction. So again, meeting a new roommate or an interview situation, you bring your individuality, idiosyncrasies, but you also bring all those past interactions, and that's your personal meaning that you bring to the table. And then the interpersonal meaning happens in agreement with the other person. So as you are interacting, you're coming to what's called an intersubjective. So right, we each have our own subjective ideas of what's going on, but when we agree, when we come together and we are developing an understanding, that's an intersubjective occurrence, and that's an interpersonal layer of meaning. Both of these meanings levels are achieved in conversation, and sometimes the interpersonal meaning can feed back on and shape my personal layer of meaning, so that the next time I have one of those meetings of that kind of interaction, I now think about it differently because of what happened interpersonally in this meeting, right? So those are the 3 assumptions. There's a couple of concepts in this theory that I just want to get out on the table because I think these are the most interesting parts of this particular theory. And it's the idea of stories. You're all familiar with the popular TED Talk called No Single Story, that you're not a single story. And this theory actually predates that TED Talk by decades. And it was really getting at that idea that we each have stories lived. And these are stories that have been co-constructed, that we perform with others. And they're things that we have done together with other people, and it's stories that we've lived out. Now, coordination, the CMM, the coordinated part of this theory, takes place when we fit our stories lived into the stories lived by others in a way that makes life more satisfying, happier, more fulfilling. And so that coordination of stories lived is a big part of this theory, where we fit our stories lived in with others' stories lived. Then there's the stories told part, and this is where we make sense of all of the stories. So these are the narratives. Some of them are self-narratives, some are narratives that we actually speak, that we use to make sense of all of the stories lived. The stories you've lived in your own life that have created your own path and the way you make sense of that, the stories that you lived that you've meshed with other people's stories lived. As you talk about those stories, the stories you tell about those stories lived is the coherence part of this theory. I think it's super interesting how people talk about and make sense about their actual lived experience. And then the management of meaning is the extent to which we interpret each other's stories the same way in order to achieve coherence. Because I might disagree with a story that you told, or the way that you told it, what you've taken from that experience, or when you differ about what happened in a stories lived situation. You can see where that might create a management of meaning conflict, for instance. And then some people talk about in this theory that there's some aspect of stories untold, that there's a mystery dimension to this theory of stories yet to happen. And that's an important idea that we might play with in class. So these are the assumptions and some of the key concepts. I want to leave you with a few questions as we bounce out of this particular overview. And the first is, what does it mean to say that this is a rules theory about the construction of social reality? So what does that mean to you? You might need to go back and look at chapter 2 and maybe a little bit of chapter 3 to think about that. Would this be a scientific theory or a humanistic theory? And spoiler, you can just flip to the end of the chapter and your authors tell you that answer. And then thirdly, what's the difference that you see between this theory, CMM, and the previous theory that we looked at, symbolic interaction theory? That's it for this particular overview. We'll see you guys in class very soon to play with this theory of coordinated management of meaning.